After the light died. Chapters 13 and 14. Silent depths, relentless skies. Robert stretched out a shaking hand in the darkness. His vision was enhanced by the goggles he wore. It wasn't exactly like something out of a horror film where the protagonist reached out to touch something in the shadow and then lost a hand just before they lost their life. Instead, there was only cool stone, then air. The rock he touched curved around to a hidden space, a space not occupied by more rock. Instead, it was a passageway, and from that passageway came little chittering noises, almost insect-like. They weren't close at hand, they were echoing off the stone walls. Robert looked over his shoulder. "Keep filming." He mouthed the words and then gestured toward the hidden passage. He then pressed his body to the wall and followed the contours of the rough, wet stone around. The way in was so small he had to suck in his breath to fit, and when he exhaled he couldn't do so all the way. For a moment, sweat sprang to his brow and instinctive fear coursed throughout body. "I'm trapped!" his mind screamed, but when he sucked in his breath again, he was able to move another centimeter. It was slow going, but with his hands out shoulder level at his sides and moving up and down, he felt his way through. Turning his head away from his wife and toward the distant, unknown darkness, toward the noise, he continued to progress. He uttered no words as he went. Instead, he focused only on his steady breathing, taking only the smallest possible inhales and exhales as the stone scraped beneath his feet. Time was nothing inside a cave. The ageless nature of the witnesses of stone hit home like a hammer struck a nail. For this natural structure which existed over billions of years, Robert's whole life from birth to death was not even the span of a child's breath. Whatever they imagined, I'm sure it was not a pest removal task for alien invaders. Robert's thoughts were repugnant in every way, and yet he didn't shunt them aside. He needed the distraction to keep his sense of claustrophobia at bay. He could hear Susan following behind him. Her feet were almost perfectly synchronized with his own, but she clearly lacked the same struggle or claustrophobic fear he had, as she eased along so quickly that she had her hand over his within 2 or 3 minutes. It felt roughly the length of a football field, but how close he was in that guess was hard to say. But when he reached the end, the passage opened up into a massive complex. Robert's jaw dropped open in disbelief. The cavern within was so large he couldn't see the end of it even with his enhancing technology. Spires hung down and thrust up like upper and lower teeth in the jaws of some great predator ripped from the dawn of time. The echoing drips of water created a faint musical air with their endless rhythm, and near to his side he saw that an outcrop of stone had a segment worn away so that it made a faint bowl shape. Water pooled there, clear and perfect, begging to be drunk. On an act of impulse, Robert swept out a hand, snatched some into his cupped palm, and took a sip. Far removed from the tainted waters of the still heavily polluted Terra, the water was cold and clean, and went down with a kind of crisp smoothness he'd only previously read about in old books. Then no sooner than he had his hand at his side again, he saw the bowl begin to refill as new droplets found their place to pool within. When he smacked his lips, he turned his ear to the source of the faint chittering. The sound seemed to echo from everywhere and come from nowhere, and yet that made little sense. Until he began walking the walls and found the first passage. When he stood in front of it, he heard the noises coming from there. And rather than follow, he continued along the wall, found another passage, and yet more noises came from there. It did not take long before he realized the truth. A massive nest exists here, or a series of nests. This has to be much, much larger than anything we've seen on the surface. He tried counting the noises, but whatever served as their language was too confusing even if the echo wasn't so disruptive. Susan was no fool. When she saw him clip the mouth protector to his helmet and flip on the communication option by sliding his finger over the touch-sensitive section of the chin strap, she did the same. There are some alive down here. A lot of them. Robert's voice was a whisper in the dark. A whisper only Susan could hear through the headset she wore. Sounds like, "How many do you think?" Susan asked, her body tensed. It was one thing to face the creepers while heavily armed, catching them in ambush and taking them unprepared. It was a whole other thing to face who knew how many of them with no gun and no backup. "I don't know. There have to be at least 20 or 30 nests down here, and that's assuming that those don't lead even deeper into the underground. For all we know, there could be hundreds of nests and thousands of individuals. I doubt it, but I can't rule it out." Robert's voice was full of uncertainty, an unusual thing for him, and that by itself brought uncertainty into Susan's spirit. "We should turn back?" She whispered into her microphone, and Robert nodded in the dark. "I agree, that's the smart thing to do," he said. His voice crackled in the mic, and he looked away from her and toward the nearest gap in the stone leading down toward the chittering noises. Susan was 3 steps from him before she looked back and realized he wasn't moving or looking in her direction. She approached on hasty feet and grabbed his bicep in her hand. It was a powerful arm, far more so than it had been when they first met. Still, her grip was strong in its own right, and it forced his attention back to her. "What's the matter? We should go. You said it yourself, it's the smart thing to do," she insisted, fairly hissing the word smart through gritted teeth. They were gritted because she knew he wasn't going to do the smart thing. He didn't shake off her hand, only touched it with his free one. "It's a chance to make contact, peaceful contact," he said. "If you inform security forces about this, they'll give us a medal, maybe a big windfall reward. But they'll also send teams down to wipe these people out as an infestation. This might be the first, even the only chance to talk to the creepers. Or die, and that peaceful contact ends with you in pieces," Susan pointed out, and Robert nodded again. "Somebody's got to try. And God knows I owe them the attempt or revenge. If this doesn't work, do what you think best, dear," he said. Adding the term of endearment at the end was enough to bring her up short. Her eyes welled up. She briefly thought of telling him that she was pregnant, that he was going to be a father, and had no business risking himself like this now. But as she opened her mouth behind her mask to speak, she recalled her own foot coming up, then down on a creeper egg, and seeing the soft body ooze out. "I owe them too," she admitted, then nodded in return. "I'll head back to the house. If you make contact, come back home. The rope will be there. If you don't make it, I'll manage," she said, averting her intended revelation. "Thanks, I'll do my best," he promised, and squeezed her hand again. He then moved to the entrance of the cavern and waited while she disappeared back the way they came. He lingered there until he heard the faint, fuzzy transmission of clicks telling him she was clear. Then with one deep breath, he stepped into the cave and toward the clicking voices. There was more water than he anticipated, not just dripping, but running down the sides of the rock in places to form tiny rivulets that went on a downslope deeper along the path he walked. His chest tightened more than it had when he was sandwiched in the tiny passage that got him this far, but his growing fear did not dissuade his advance, and soon he stepped into view of the nest. All chattering stopped dead. In front of him was a large creeper surrounded by 3 smaller ones and a cluster of even smaller ones around a clutch of eggs. The moment between them all was frozen in time, and then when that frozen moment was shattered by the long-headed creature's sense of horror, the adults and juveniles all went for the spears that lay on the cave floor. Before they had them raised, however, Robert did the only thing he could think to do. He raised his hands above his head and dropped to his knees, attempting to appear as non-threatening as possible. He shouted, "Wait!" His eyes were closed in anticipation of their never opening again. His body braced for the final moment of pain, but it did not come. The largest of the creepers held its arm out in front of its family, a firm-sounding chitter cautioning them to stop. Robert's breathing grew loud enough for him to hear it, and his hands moved with glacial slowness down to his head. The spears of the creepers moved threateningly several times in short, jerking motions in the universal warning that I will fucking kill you. But the outstretched arm of the largest of them did not waver. The killing blow did not come, and Robert managed the removal of his helmet. He set it down beside his right knee, setting it so that the camera was pointed at an upward angle. He put one hand to his chest and said, "Robert?" The chittering language grew frantic and fast as he believed they understood. The big one put its other arm against its chest, and its mouth said Chittikin. First contact. It's a start, Robert thought, and he began to start a trade in words that would not end any time soon. Lucretia watched the bombardment begin. The starbase had been outfitted with everything the Kikinis could muster. Their shields had been upgraded, and they'd even mustered more than just one frigate, though her initially impressed state hadn't lasted. Mercenaries. She thought when she recognized the key differences in ship design from those she'd faced already. If they'd had those mercenaries earlier, I doubt we could have destroyed that other colony, let alone advanced on this place with enough force to crush them. But since they didn't? She shook her head and then brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. Advance. Fire at will. Target the mercenary ships first. As the Absolution fleet advanced, the mercenaries came on just ahead of the lone pair of frigates the Kikinian government had managed to cobble together in a surprisingly powerful, desperate effort. Win or lose, Lucretia had no doubt that the little power was now fundamentally bankrupt, not that it would do any good. Her armada was more than enough for a force half the size of her own, and soon the mercenaries did exactly as she expected. The ships rocked and rolled, putting up a flexible and dynamic fight while ensuring the least possible damage to the hulls and distributing the shield damage over multiple ship sectors. But mercenaries of all kinds are the foremost pragmatists. You can't spend credits if you're dead. She reasoned as they must have, and when the ships sustained substantial damage under the withering fire of the Terran fleet, they warped out, unwilling to die for the people who merely paid them to fight. The half a dozen mercenary ships fled without any of them being destroyed, and the little frigates fought with valor that, even being aliens, Lucretia could not help but respect. Stubborn, she thought, and stood in a silent act of respect that nobody would see as the pair of frigates, firm in their resolve and reasoning independently that their world held no chance if they fought while trying to stay alive, chose to ram the Terran vessels head-on. The flagship rocked and trembled as the first frigate impacted it, having avoided fire well enough to circle around and strike the ship in its rear engines. It hung there, dead in space, but not destroyed, merely disabled, while the other frigate had more luck, slamming into a cruiser just as the shields wavered, and the Terran ship was destroyed with all hands. The explosion of both ships lit up the night sky well enough that Lucretia felt sure that it was visible from the planetary surface, and then the remainder of her armada spread out and targeted the starbase. It was obvious from scans that it had been utterly stripped of scientific energy, storage, trade, and even intelligence features, and what was put in place was a slew of weapons, rockets, blasters, missiles, every form of armament the Kikini had at their disposal unloaded on the Terran ships, but right away Lucretia saw what no other had. He's inexperienced or he's panicked. Poor fool, she reasoned as the one commanding the starbase fired at everything in range, thus doing a little damage to many but destroying none. The shields of the Terran vessels shimmered in the dark, but as they hammered the starbase alone while it tried to fight everything at once, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. Fires began to break out all over the base as the shields went down and platforms began to explode as their ordnance was ignited. She didn't need to zoom in to see the bodies flying off into space, or to know the likely effect this battle was having on the once resolute people on the world that must have known defeat was nigh. As the starbase ceased all operability, its lights died, and scans showed the last life signs fading out in what was deemed to be a medical bay. The war was over in all but name. Take up orbiting positions above their world. Target food supplies, dams, water filtration locations, and power stations first in that order. Only when those are wrecked should you begin targeting the cities, Lucretia ordered with a pragmatic air. A transmission interrupted her and she flipped it on. It was Captain Parks. Ma'am, a handful of transports were detected fleeing the planet during the battle. We believe them to be refugees. What should we do? He asked. His piercing gray eyes revealed no private thoughts, but even if they had, Lucretia would not have considered them. Where were they headed? She asked while she reviewed the data on the planetary population, resource, and other material. Croprignus, ma'am, he answered, or rather spat. Let them go. They'll either be destroyed by the Kixel, or devoured by them, or simply enslaved. No matter what, that will be the end of their people. Focus on the planet. Damn fools. If they'd just surrendered, they could have at least had nominal independence. Martyrdom only matters when you have some real hope for victory. Otherwise, it's just masturbatory self-aggrandization. With that thought, she flipped on the comm line that would connect her directly to her brother. Magnus, how are things going? I just wanted to let you know that we're wrapping things up here. 2 more worlds ready to colonize. Better hurry up, big brother, or I'll outrun you yet again. She smirked and winked at him, and the Khan of Absolutia, master of all Terrans, laughed like any other sibling. Good, for you and for all mankind. I hadn't expected you to just turn around and conquer the Kikinis like that, but I'm glad you did. We've run into a situation here, and I needed people distracted. Magnus's voice drifted into a tone of concern, and Lucretia frowned. What kind of situation? She asked. You might not believe this, but remember the thing with the creepers on our first colony? It looks like the hero who set foot on that world first has somehow made contact with an enclave of survivors and found that they have a language. Like people. Magnus snorted. Who'd have thought? Oh, interesting. So what? She matched his snort of derision. It's our world now. What does it matter if they had a language or not? Sister of mine, you know how I adore your pragmatism on these things, Magnus said indulgently and folded his hands together on his desk. But most people don't have the strength to push the weak aside and do what needs to be done. They grow soft in the heart and soft in the head and start prioritizing aliens over their own. With the Kikinis, we can pass off their extermination as a consequence of war. Those creepers were too primitive for that. People will complain, and unhappy elements, disruptive elements, put the unity we require to fend off the divine shitbirds at bay and establish Terra as a force to be feared in a galaxy full of terrors. So have the dissidents picked up and send out troops to hunt down the rest. Just bill it as a further elimination of an invasive species, confiscate any artifacts, and within a month people will forget. Nobody will care as long as their own chance for gain is undiminished, Lucretia said with a huff, and Magnus laughed deeply. You're a cynic, he accused. You're right, but so am I, she retorted. True. But just in case, after you're done with pacifying our new system, route the fleet to the colony and assist with the job. A few extra Marines should be able to handle the creepers with no problem. Consider that to be your reward for good service, the Khan said with a taunting voice. My reward is more work? She asked rhetorically. He answered immediately. What else? Have fun. He laughed at her again and killed the transmission between them before she could say something clever. She yawned. It hardly mattered. Cleansing would take at least a month, and that was break enough for she started doing the same job, but easier, all over again.